Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is October 22nd, and a quick reminder, we have quiz 4, which has now opened up, and so that needs to be taken by Sunday at 8 o'clock. And, of course, the discussions in Module 4, discussions 7 and 8, those are due by tomorrow, Friday, at 8 o'clock. And so let's make sure we get all of that done. And also, regarding your exams, expect to have your exam grades in Canvas by the end of the day today. Okay, just getting those finished up, and we can go over those if you want. If you have any questions about your Canvas, about your Exam 1 grade, by all means, get in touch with me. So we will clarify any issues there. But I am going to get those done here very quickly this afternoon. Okay, so anyway, when we left off, we were mentioning the Trail of Tears and the Indian removals, certainly one of the very dark and tragic chapters in our nation's history, certainly one of those events that we should not be proud of. The problem that we run into is that to really understand what was going on with the Indian removals forces us to recognize that the leadership in Washington really was kind of backed between a rock and a hard place. They can't just sit back and do nothing, because that would simply lead to the effective extermination of the Native Americans. Washington was powerless to use any type of military force to stop locals from squatting on the land and abusing Native rights. And of course, forced removal is exactly what the Trail of Tears was. And so there's just sort of a no-win situation. And as we know, now tragically for American Indians, they never could win, right? Every time they tried to win or preserve their way of life, it just never worked out. Here is the way that we should perhaps interpret it. They were part of a larger global system, just like any other indigenous people around the world. They were not existing within a bubble. They were not existing independent of the world around them. And so when the very first white man stepped off the boat at Jamestown, when the very first English settler looked around and said, hey, let's make this work, the indigenous lifestyle of Native Americans was over. It was ticking. And it was only a matter of time before, one way or the other, the modern world was going to be there. And there was nothing that anybody could do to stop that. No matter how sympathetic anyone would be, you don't get to run away from modernization, good or bad. And so the tragedy of what happened to the Indians isn't that they were forced to move into the modern world. We all have to move into the modern world. You had grandparents 20 years ago that were insisting that they would never use a computer or a smartphone, right? Guess what? The modern world caught up with them, and now they're using them. There's just no getting away from having to modernize. The tragedy is that when they tried to modernize, when they tried to adapt, like the Cherokee, they tried to become peaceful farmers. They developed a written language. They wanted to work with the whites. Even then, their rights were still violated. I can assure you, no matter what had happened to them, no matter how tolerant society would have been, if we were to go out on the Great Plains, they would not be living in teepees and hunting buffaloes in 2020, would they? Right? They wouldn't be living out in the forests along the rivers and streams and, hunting furry animals the way their ancestors did. That's not the way the modern world works. But they should have been permitted to adapt to modern life in a way that respected their dignity as humans. And that is the tragic part. Another aspect about this that we just have to keep in mind is that there is no single bad guy. It's very convenient to point the finger at one person, usually Andrew Jackson, and say he's the reason all of this happened. I can assure you, he is only one player in a very, very long line of people that decided that the land that the Indians were sitting on was worth stripping them of their humanity. It was a multi-generational process, and he was simply the man who came along at the tail end of it. Ironically, and this is truly ironically, Andrew Jackson later in life actually had quite a few Native American friends. They would come and visit him at the Hermitage, even the Creeks, after the Creek War, you would think that they wouldn't like him too much. And I can assure you, he's certainly not popular among them today. But he actually had a lot of them that considered him a friend. And after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Andrew Jackson actually adopted a Native American orphan. You know, there was a dead baby, a live baby with a dead mom. And so Andrew Jackson actually adopted him and raised him as his own son at the Hermitage, his plantation in Nashville. These things are weird. I don't know any other way to put it. Sometimes you don't see a lot of logic, but there we have it. But I can assure you, you have to look at the much larger context of what's going on in Washington to really understand the Trail of Tears. And it must be understood, nobody runs away from modernization. Nobody. We are part of a global society of humans. How we treat each other as we modernize is what really matters. Anyway, moving on. We need to talk about Jacksonian politics. We need to get back into the political game. And we're going to move kind of quickly. In 1828, as we know, Jackson wins in a landslide. He is now the president. The man that ran as his vice president was John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was a senator from South Carolina, a very affluent planter. His plantation is now the campus of Clemson University, just in case you're wondering. Clemson sits on the Calhoun plantation. Very wealthy, very influential. Calhoun wanted to be president. He made no secret of the fact that he had presidential ambitions. Like a typical South Carolina planter, Calhoun despised the tariff because, of course, the tariff benefits northern manufacturers at the expense of farmers. We talked about that earlier. You end up paying more for the stuff you buy, and in many times it enables manufacturers to price gouge. So Southerners do not like the tariff. Northerners, particularly in northern cities, do like it. Calhoun and Jackson see eye to eye on a lot of issues. Calhoun doesn't like big banks. Calhoun doesn't like aggressive foreign policy. Calhoun is a Jeffersonian Jacksonian. So it seemed to be a pretty good match. And Jackson sees Calhoun as a good future president at first. Jackson is kind of mentoring Calhoun and expects him to run. Opposing Jackson will be a political party eventually known as the Whigs. We have mentioned them before. Now, they don't call themselves this until the 1830s, but we'll go ahead and give them that title now. They believe in economic growth. They believe in federal funding of internal improvements. They like banks and business. They like the idea that you can be dirt poor and you can go to a bank and borrow some money, buy a piece of land, pay it off over the next few years, and end up a prosperous yeoman farmer, or possibly even more. That's a good thing. That's how America becomes great. So what's so terrible about it? And of course, we've already talked how Jackson and Jefferson and Calhoun saw this as corrupting, and you get the idea. The leader of the Whigs is Henry Clay. I think I've mentioned that before. And Jackson hates Clay. We're talking bone-deep hatred, because he believes that Henry Clay denied him the 1824 election, and of course Clay is a Whig that encourages people to go into debt and buy things they can't afford and gives the banks all of this money and power. For the most part, the Whig Party and what would later be called the Democratic Party of Jackson aren't really regional. There's plenty of Whigs in the North and South, plenty of Democrats in the North and South. Although the Whigs do tend to be a little bit more popular in the urban areas, and so that makes them a little more popular in the North. These are not regional parties yet. We're not North and South. We'll get there, but we're not there yet. But we need to talk about the tariff. We need to talk about the tariff. And by the 1820s, this idea of putting a tax on foreign goods is a big issue in our developing nation. And I want to remind everybody, if I put a tax on something coming in from England, and I tell those English, we're going to put a tax on your shoes, those English are going to put a tax on our cotton sent over there. So if you're a southern cotton farmer, that tariff means you're paying for it. You know, if we put a tax on those English goods being imported, those Americans that compete are just going to raise their prices to match them. You know, if we force the English to sell their shoes for more money, those folks in Boston and New York that are making shoes are just going to raise their prices to match the English prices. And so Southerners hate the tariff. It is unfair. It is forcing the South to pay, giving the North a break. In 1824, after an awful lot of fighting, Congress passed an increase in the tariff, which infuriated the Southerners. And Southerners demanded that something be done about this, and they vowed that they would not permit another increase. Well, in 1828, the pro-tariff people, who would become the Whigs, again, we'll go ahead and call them the Whigs now, decided to play a political game. And they proposed a bill that would hike the tariff absolutely through the roof. Just a really high tariff, a tariff even higher than they would have wanted. And they knew that it would fail. It's too crazy to pass, but it would make them look good to the voters in their districts because they promoted it. So we're going to promote something that people like, and when it fails, we can blame somebody else and it will make us look good. At least we fought the good fight. Y'all get where I'm coming from. Well, the problem is it ended up passing. And before John Quincy Adams left office, he signed it into law. And so a new super high tariff ends up getting passed that even the people promoting the bill didn't actually want. When it came to the floor vote, they realized we have to vote for it because we promoted it, but boy, this is going to hack some people off. Immediately, the South cried foul. The South just throws an absolute tantrum, and they begin calling it the Tariff of Abominations. And now we have to start looking at some deeper issues here. And we're going to all be South Carolinians right now. You know, we grow cotton or rice or whatever it is they grow in South Carolina. And all of a sudden, the government in Washington has imposed a tariff on us that benefits those people in New York and Boston. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's fair that one section of the country should get a benefit and another section of the country should have to pay the bill. You know, if I'm sitting in a restaurant and I'm eating my meal, and you're sitting over there at your table, and all of a sudden the waiter comes over and he gives me my bill, and then he gives me your bill too and says, by the way, you're paying for his meal as well as yours. I don't know about you, but my answer is going to be, no, I'm not. Y'all following me? And that's the way South Carolina is seeing this. You know, we're at a restaurant here, and all of a sudden we're being forced to pay their bill too. And Calhoun, when he becomes vice president, being from South Carolina, absolutely blows his top over this and insists that this is unfair to the South, unfair to South Carolina. But of course, he's not in the Senate anymore, is he? And Calhoun starts arguing that the federal government should not have that much power, that the federal government should not be able to impose these kinds of rules where one state pays and the other state gets the meal. He publishes the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Now, he does it anonymously. He doesn't put his name on it. This was actually kind of common thing that people would do, publish something anonymously. Everybody knew he wrote it. It was an open secret that he was the author. And in it, he argues the doctrine of nullification. In it, he argues the doctrine of nullification. Very simply put, states can nullify federal laws within their borders. According to Calhoun, the state of South Carolina does not have to enforce a federal law. South Carolina only enforces state laws. And since South Carolina does not like the tariff, South Carolina will not enforce the tariff in Charleston. The answer is no. The federal government cannot force us to enforce its own laws. This was wildly popular in South Carolina, yet what it really means is that federal laws have no power. Federal laws have no authority at all if states can just decide that they don't matter. Andrew Jackson was absolutely furious about this. Now, Jackson didn't like the Tariff of Abominations. He was not a fan of it. Nevertheless, Jackson's argument was exactly what it should be. This is a federal law. It was passed in Congress. It was signed by President Adams. I don't like it, but I'm the president and it's my job to enforce it. The law is the law. And we don't have a union. We don't have a country. If states can selectively decide what laws they want to follow and what laws they don't. Think about that for a minute. If you can just decide the rules you're going to live by and ignore the ones that you don't like, well, we're not going to have much of a society if that's the case, right? I don't think that speed limit applies to me, so I'm just going to go as fast as I want, right? I know the sign says yield, but I'm going to keep on going because I disagree with that yield sign. Doesn't work that way, folks, and that's the way Jackson looked at it. And he and Calhoun, they really kind of went at odds with each other over this. Then something personal happened. And sometimes personal issues can bleed over into politics, I suppose. I'm going to talk about this very quickly, but Jackson and Calhoun really fell out largely over this. And it sounds ridiculous, but put ourselves in the mindset of people back then. Remember, this is a different era and a different culture. This is known as the Peggy Eaton affair or the Petticoat affair. Now, follow me here. There was a woman by the name of Peggy Eaton. There was a woman by the name of Peggy Eaton. But originally, she was Peggy Timberlake. And she was married to a naval officer, a man named John Timberlake, and they're a married couple, and good for them. Well, John Timberlake died at sea. So now Peggy Eaton is a widow. And within a month of her husband's death, she married John Eaton. She married John Eaton. So she's a widow. Now she remarries. Now in 2020, good for her, right? If your husband dies, you can remarry, right? Nobody's got a problem with that. Well, yes, they do in 1828. Because you see, social custom dictated that a woman should wait at least a year, maybe even 2 or 3, before she would consider a new husband if she is widowed. It was considered rather scandalous to get married so quickly after your husband had died. And John Eaton was the Secretary of War. He was a member of Jackson's cabinet. Now, I will agree with you that this is kind of ridiculous. Who cares? She got remarried. It's her life. It's a free country. If she and John Eaton want to get married, they can get married. She's a single woman now. However, That's not how the wives of the cabinet members saw it. You see, there is a lot of socialization in Washington. There's all kinds of parties and events and things like that. And at the time, the wives of the cabinet members would have their own little social club, and they would meet and, play cards or do whatever wives of cabinet members do. The wives of senators would often be included in this. If your husband is a ranking member of the government in one way or another, you have a social duty to put on your dresses and go to the balls. Y'all get where I'm coming from, right? Well, the cabinet wives started shunning Peggy Eaton. Think, Real Housewives of Washington, D.C., right? They start, shunning her. They start spreading rumors about her. Eventually, a rumor emerges that she was having an affair with John Eaton and that she was sleeping around on her husband Timberlake, and that's why they got married so quickly, that they were already getting giggity long before John Timberlake died, which is terribly scandalous. And this is very embarrassing, and this is very frustrating, and it's causing a lot of tension because these women are very brash about it. And the leader of the anti-Peggy Eaton crowd, who is being so rude and so cruel to her, is John Calhoun's wife, a woman by the name of Floride Calhoun, who came from the South Carolina planter elite, of course. The social customs and how a wife is supposed to behave is deeply a part of her identity. She firmly believes she's better than everybody else because she is a plantation mistress and they are among the largest planters in the country. You get the idea. Well, this gets under Andrew Jackson's skin. It gets under his skin in a big way. And you can say to yourself, at the end of the day, who cares? It's, a bunch of women pecking at each other, but this shouldn't be a big deal. But to Jackson it was, and here's why. You will recall that Andrew Jackson had a similar issue with his wife Rachel. She had divorced her first husband. She was actually technically not divorced on paper when he married her. They fixed that. But the fact that she was a divorcee and the fact that that paperwork issue had been a bit of a thing had always been what the women in Nashville talked about. And his wife Rachel was shunned, and his wife Rachel had been not invited to the parties, and they had been rude to the Jacksons, and man, that bugged him. In his mind, this is my business, this is my private life, this is my wife, y'all need to back off. And so Jackson called all the cabinet members in, and he told them that y'all need to get your wives in line. Peggy Eaton is a nice girl. There's nothing wrong with her. She is legally married to John Eaton. They love each other. They're a couple. This woman's husband died, and she remarried, and goodness knows you should be treating her with more respect. And he turned to Calhoun, and he said, you straighten out your wife, and you do it now. I expect her to be friendly to Peggy Eaton. I expect her to treat her with respect. Jackson's wife actually died in 1828, right before he became president. And he absolutely believed that all of the insults that were thrown at her while he was campaigning contributed to her death. Because remember, I mentioned that 1828 campaign was really nasty. And there was a lot of bad blood that went back and forth between the two camps. And the issue with Rachel, the fact that she was a divorcee and the fact that she had still been married when she and Jackson got married, boy, that was really thrown about. And it was a big deal to Andrew Jackson. He did not like that at all. Well, I got some advice for you, fellas. We got a couple of guys in the room here. I'm gonna give you some advice. Don't try to straighten your wife out like that, okay? You're not gonna win. And instead of doing what Jackson wanted, the entire cabinet, except one, resigned. They walked away. Seriously. It became such a stink that they all quit. The only man that didn't resign was Martin Van Buren, and Martin Van Buren was a bachelor. He didn't have a wife to begin with, so it didn't matter to him, and he agreed with Jackson. Peggy Eaton's a perfectly nice woman, and she can marry whoever she wants, and we've got real business to deal with. And so Jackson and Calhoun fell out in a big way, and by 1830, their relationship was over, and John C. Calhoun resigned the vice presidency. So the Peggy Eaton affair as ridiculous as it sounds, ended up having a big impact on Jackson's cabinet. Calhoun will then go back to the Senate, but his presidential ambitions are pretty much dashed. At that point, he's not going to become president because it became very obvious that Jackson doesn't like him, and he was never really able to get it together. Jackson now begins to promote Van Buren as the future president, and Martin Van Buren is the guy who has it together that Jackson wants to succeed him. Well, here's Van Buren. And, I don't know, maybe it's me, but I think if you throw in a little John Adams and a little Martin Van Buren, you end up with Larry from the Three Stooges. I don't know. But that's what I always think of whenever I see this. So, by how fashions change, right? Let's talk about another issue from the Jackson era, and this would be the one that would define him more than anything else, and that is the bank war. That is the bank war. You will recall that Alexander Hamilton got the first Bank of the United States chartered in 1796, and it was a 20-year charter. And the Bank of the United States held the federal treasury, and it loaned money out to local banks, and it was a private company with shareholders, many shareholders not even in the United States. And this was controversial because it's good for economic growth and it's good to manage our economy, yet at the same time, it is a powerful organization with a lot of influence in Washington, and nobody is electing anybody that runs it. I don't know about you, but I don't like the idea of foreign investors being able to manipulate congressmen and senators for their own means. That sounds kind of scary. So the debate over the bank is a big one. It was rechartered in 1816 for another 20 years, and so instead of it being the first Bank of the United States, now it is the second Bank of the United States, not the second band of the United States. Whoops, I need to fix that. That's a bit of a typo. I'm sure they got their groove on in lots of ways, but that's supposed to say bank. The Democrats wanted the bank to go away. They didn't like it. Again, all it does is encourage people to go into debt and manipulate the economy for the benefit of a bunch of guys in suits that never break a sweat. The Whigs thought the bank was critical to American economic strength. And the whole reason why all of this land is being developed and all of these railroads are getting built and all of this growth is happening is because of the bank and these bankers who know how to manage the economy. And you can decide which side of that you would be on. I hear the arguments of both. Jackson made it clear that he despised the bank and that he would do anything possible to kill it. It's got to go away. And in 1836, the bank is up for recharter. So we're going to have to go another 20 years in 1836, but Congress has to pass it, and Congress has to pass a law rechartering it, and the president has to sign it. And Jackson makes it clear, I ain't signing any bill that recharters the bank. The Whigs believed that they had a winning issue, that when the American people were forced to make a choice, the American people would agree that the bank was needed. Despite its controversies, every farmer that has ever borrowed money to buy their land and paid it off owes the bank for that. And all of the development that we see is all because of the bank. And when the American people really think about it, they will understand that the bank is needed. And so instead of waiting until 1836, Congress passed a bank recharter bill in 1832, when Jackson is up for re-election. And they think that if Jackson vetoes this bank bill, it will possibly get him to lose the presidential election, because killing the bank is definitely going to hurt the economy. Now, I got some advice for you. Don't pick a fight with Andrew Jackson. Just not a good idea. The president of the bank was a fellow by the name of Nicholas Biddle, a very brilliant man. He had a lot of accomplishments aside from being the man who ran the bank, but he was a brilliant economist, and he explained, the bank loans money to local banks. People borrow money from local banks. Farmers pay off their land. This is good. economic growth. We need this. He understood how to do it, and he had a good argument. But guys like Jackson were saying, no, you're nothing more than a corrupt banker. You're making all of your money off of the labor of everyone else, and you're that puppet master controlling the economy. And if a bill comes up in Congress that isn't good for the bank, you show up with a briefcase full of lots and lots of bills, and you put it on that senator's desk and say, vote for this. That's corruption that will destroy our country. Again, you get the debate. Well, the bank bill passed Congress, as I mentioned. It was a huge political fight. Jackson made it clear he would not compromise. The bank was going to die. He was vetoing that bank bill. It did hurt his popularity, but he was still reelected in 1832. And so it was an unpopular move, and he did not win in 1832 by the same margin that he won in 1828. His opponents declared him King Andrew, a dictator who unilaterally decided how everybody was going to manage their money. He was compared to European monarchs who treated people like pawns. But nonetheless, like I said, he did win in 1832 despite this issue. It was not a good political move on his part, but he's still Andrew Jackson. He's not going to lose. And in 1836, Jackson has now served 2 terms, and he does not run for a third. There is now a tradition that is well established that 2 terms is the limit. He was eligible, of course. He could have, but he chose not to. And he retired back to Nashville at the Hermitage, and he would live for another 9 years. And he continued to write letters and remain sort of active in the background, expressing his opinion on various topics. And by then he was, deeply respected by the American people, but his career was over. But in 1836, we're going to elect another president, and the Whigs are desperate to win. They didn't really win in 1824. They only got the election because of a game they played. Jackson in 1828, Jackson again in 1832. They got to win. But Martin Van Buren won. He stooged his way into the White House, I guess. Van Buren was from New York. He was perfectly intelligent and perfectly capable. He was very much like Jackson in terms of his political ideology. He certainly didn't have the personality that Jackson did or the, adoration from the public, but he was deeply respected. As a result of Jackson's vetoing of the bank bill, in 1837, the bank shut down. After 1836, the charter was up, and that was it for the bank. Now, this didn't mean that local banks were going to go out of business, but it did mean that they were going to have to radically change their business model. The Federal Treasury was divided up among lots of little banks, for example, and that was a bit complicated. But Jackson also, one of his last moves in office, and remember, the idea here is never go into debt, never borrow money. Pay for what you have and work hard to get it. That's Jackson's philosophy. Jackson issued what is now known, or what was known then too, as the Specie Circular. An executive order. This executive order, now follow me here, required all land purchased from the government to be bought with currency backed by gold. All land bought from the government must be bought with currency backed by gold. So to keep it very simple, it's a lot harder to buy land because you got to buy it with real money backed by real gold. And your average farmer doesn't have that, and your average bank is very reluctant to loan that. Yes, that currency backed by gold exists, But banks aren't going to loan that to any Tom, Dick, or Harry that shows up wanting a loan, because that's real money. That's real money. And so it takes a lot more work to buy land. Now, I want us to play a little game here real quick. Think about where I'm coming from. If a car dealership is willing to give a car and give a loan to buy a car to anybody who shows up without paying attention to your background, without paying attention to whether or not you have a job, without looking at your income, if anybody that shows up and says, yes, I'll borrow the money, give me that car dealership is going to sell a lot of cars, aren't they? Now, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with them just saying, we'll loan money to anybody who wants some, come buy a car with it? Now, a lot of those people aren't going to pay their car notes, are they? You know, if you just make it real easy for people to borrow money, yeah, you'll sell a lot of cars, but you're also going to end up repossessing a lot of cars, aren't you? You know, a lot of people will borrow money irresponsibly. A lot of people will borrow money that don't have the finances to pay it back. And so, you know, that ain't good, is it? And of course, the people that go in and make those foolish decisions, sure, they're adults and they made that choice and it's their fault, but nonetheless, that's a pretty big problem for them once their car gets repossessed, right? That hurts them later down the road financially and makes it even more difficult for them. And so you can say, well, that's their own fault for being stupid with their money, but at the same time, you're creating victims there, aren't you? What happens if the car dealership requires you to show up with all kinds of paperwork, and you have to have a down payment, and you have to prove your income, and you have to prove that you have a good job, and you have to have a solid credit rating, proving that you've always paid back money that you borrowed? You're not going to sell a lot of cars, are you? But those cars will be paid off, right? The people that borrow money for those cars are very likely to end up paying that car off, which is far more responsible. Are you following me? That's what the specie circular did. If you're going to buy land for the government, basically you're going to really be able to prove that you can pay it off. Because the banks are not going to loan that hard money willy-nilly. Banks don't like this, just in case you're wondering. You would think banks like this, but banks don't make money unless they loan money, right? So banks want to loan money to any Tom, Dick, or Harry that shows up. We'll worry about repossessing it later on when those idiots don't pay it back, but for now, let's loan money out. Banks are very irresponsible, traditionally speaking, when it comes to loaning out somebody else's money, which is what they're always doing. So anyway, the specie circular dramatically slowed down Western development. It dramatically slowed down Western land sales. 800 banks ended up shutting down because it was too risky to loan gold-backed currency, and so they ended up closing their doors. The United States fell into an economic recession. Martin Van Buren got the brunt of this in terms of what the American public thought. And Jackson didn't feel bad about it at all. You know, his logic was, do not borrow money to buy land. And if you are going to borrow money to buy land, it needs to be responsibly. Even then it's a bad idea. And again, you just kind of have to decide where you stand on that issue. Slow economic growth, but responsible economic growth, or fast economic growth, but hey, you know, we're going to make some bad loans in the process. It's really it's really kind of a philosophy that you have to decide. Well, in 1840, we have another presidential election, of course, and the Whigs are desperate to get somebody in office. The Whigs are absolutely desperate to get somebody in office. They lost in 24, but ended up getting in anyway. In 28, they lost big. In 32, they lost. In 36, they lost. They're sick of the Democrats winning election after election. I'll ask you very quickly. What made Jackson so popular ultimately with the American people? What was the one aspect of Jackson that made him more popular than anything else that he did? Why did the American people love him so much? I'll tell you, he was a war hero, right? The Battle of New Orleans, saving our nation from the British, defeating the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Andrew Jackson was a war hero. and all of the other things that he did in office were always secondary to that. And the American people loved him no matter what he did, because he was General Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. So if you're the Whig leadership and you just can't seem to win an election running Henry Clay, who ran in 36 or whatever, I got an idea for you. How about we dig up a war hero? Let's dig up our own version of Andrew Jackson. Sound like a plan? That's what they did. In 1840, the Whigs dug up, and they really did dig up because he was certainly not young, William Henry Harrison, Old Tip, the hero of the War of 1812, the winner of the Battle of Tippecanoe. You will recall, Jackson was the hero of New Orleans in 1812, but there were actually two heroes during that war. Harrison is the other. He defeated the Shawnee. He is beloved by the American public, and it just so happens that he is a Whig. And he is very much in line with Whig philosophy. And the Whigs ran a very expensive campaign, a very modern campaign promoting Old Tip. The first real campaign slogan came out of this one: Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That sounds great, doesn't it? It's nice. It rolls off the tongue, and that's because Tyler was his vice presidential pick. So Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Vote for Old Tip. It was called the Log Cabin Campaign. They promoted William Henry Harrison, war hero, American Westerner, born in a log cabin, raised, as an old-fashioned American, very much like Jackson, right? Started poor and worked his way up and became a hero, and it was all a lie. Harrison was not born in a log cabin, and he was never poor. He was born rich, but who cares? They dismantled the log cabin that he was born in and paraded it through streets, and there were about 20 of those log cabins going around at any particular time, and the American public just ate it up. And in 1840, Old Tip wins the election. The Whigs finally have themselves a president. The Whigs finally have themselves a president. They also did something else to make sure that they could win this presidency. John Tyler, the vice presidential candidate, he was a Virginia planter. John Tyler was a Democrat. He wasn't a Whig. John Tyler was actually a member of the other party. And the logic of the Whigs was a lot of Democrats will vote for Old Tip because of Tyler. He's showing, I'm willing to reach across the aisle. I'm willing to work with the other side. Tyler will be my advisor. I care about the Democrats too, and they have a voice. And so a Democrat will be in my administration. And that appealed to a lot of Americans. It showed, the idea that Harrison represents everybody, and it was a strong move to put Tyler on the ticket as a Democrat. Of course, the Whigs have to worry about one thing, right? If you put a Democrat as the vice president, what's the one thing you really got to worry about once he becomes president? And did I mention that Harrison is an old man? What happens if he dies in office, right? What happens if Old Tip buys the farm and goes to the great log cabin in the sky? William Henry Harrison died 30 days after taking office. And so the Whigs went through all of this trouble, and they ran this hugely expensive campaign to get one of them in office. And 30 days later, he dies, and Tyler is now the president, who is, of course, a Democrat. The Whigs were so angry about this that they would not acknowledge that Tyler was even the president. You see, the Constitution at the time didn't actually say the vice president becomes president if the president dies. The president had never died in office before. It had never been an issue. It only says the vice president gets the power of the president. The vice president gets the president's authority. Well, Tyler decided to take the oath of office and declare himself actual president, not vice president acting as president. And all of the Whigs in Congress wouldn't go along with it. They refused to recognize him as the president. They only called him the vice president. Tyler removed Harrison's cabinet, brought in his own cabinet of Democrats. That only infuriated the Whigs even more. But it's worth noting that within a couple of years, Tyler had angered the Democrats so much that they kicked him out of the party. And so by the time Tyler left office in 1845, both sides hated him. I guess that's neither here nor there. But the Whigs just can't win. They just can't win. Even when they win, they lose. And now we think, it was always believed that Harrison died of pneumonia, but now it's believed that the water that was going into the White House was actually contaminated, that there was a sewer area, a place where sewage was open and exposed, and the water that came into the White House was being contaminated by that, because it tended to be a problem for people that lived in the White House for several years. But anyway, Tyler is now the president. And before we move on to the next subject, I do want to show you a few things that I think are pretty cool that you might want to see. We do eventually get to the age of photography, and a lot of these figures that we've talked about do actually live long enough to have their real picture taken. And so if you want to know what John Quincy Adams really looked like, there is an actual photograph of Quincy. If you want to know what Henry Clay looked like, he was an old man. I mean, he's kind of got that crypt keeper look to him, but there is a real picture of Henry Clay, not just a portrait. There is a real picture of John C. Calhoun, again, looking a little bit insane, but nonetheless, there he is. And of course, President Tyler. That's a real picture of President Tyler. I think, again, that's interesting. And y'all want to know something else that's mind-blowing? One of John Tyler's grandchildren is still alive. John Tyler actually has a grandson that is still alive. And keep in mind, this is a man who became president in 1841. And so, I'm sorry, what's that? And you're absolutely right. Because camera, this is the early days of photography. What you don't see there, with shutter speeds being what they were then, you have to hold really, really still for a really long time in order to get a clear picture. There's actually a brace that they would put behind the chair they're sitting in, and it would go up and it would clip into their neck, and it would hold them super duper still while they were posing for their photograph. Because you had to sit really, really still for almost a minute in order to have the exposure come out that clear at that time. And so that's why nobody is smiling in these early photographs, right? Because you can't hold a smile without twitching your mouth for 60 seconds. And so everybody's always really stern, and they're braced in place, and they can't move, and there we go. And by the way, at this time, pictures were not really seen as being very dignified. A dignified image is a painting, but the presidents were busy. And so Tyler, and later James K. Polk, who was the first president to actually have his picture taken while sitting as president. Polk had his picture taken not because he wanted to have his picture taken, but he had other work to do, so he didn't have time to sit for a portrait. And they would have their picture taken, and then a portrait would be made from the photograph. Anyway, and yes, just in case you're wondering, there are photographs of Jackson. Jackson did live long enough to have his picture taken. These two were made about 2 weeks before he died. He was in his 80s. He had suffered a stroke, but photographs were a thing, and so the photographer showed up at the Hermitage, and they propped him in place, and these are a couple of actual photographs of Jackson himself. So I think that's very interesting. Okay, now, with that, I want to talk about our new topic, which we're going to move pretty quickly through, unfortunately. I want to talk about slavery again. I want to talk about slavery. Specifically, I want to talk about antebellum slavery. the slave system that existed roughly between 1850 and the Civil War. By the 19th century, of course, slavery is well established in North America. Slaves have lived in the colonies and now the United States for well over 100 years. And I want to talk about the actual structure of the institution itself. During the antebellum era, for the most part, slavery had been abolished north of the Ohio River and in what we call the northern states. It still existed in the southern states, largely because of plantation agriculture. And it is important to remember, the federal government does not involve itself with the states on this issue. It is up to the states to decide if they will be slave or free. Every state can choose for itself. Federal territory is where the debate comes in, because the Congress will control slavery in the areas that are not states. And you will recall in 1820, the Missouri Compromise created a rule where slavery will be prohibited north of that southern border of Missouri, but it will be permitted south. And that was the Missouri Compromise that dealt with slavery in federal territory starting in 1820. Well, let's talk about slavery and how it worked on a functional level. The first thing that we need to understand is that, and we're talking, of course, about the southern states where slavery still exists. Obviously, not everybody owned slaves. Not everybody owned slaves. The slaveholders were actually in the minority. There were fewer slaveholders than there were non-slaveholders. It is estimated that 1 out of 3 white families in the Deep South and 1 out of 4 white families in the Upper South owned at least one slave. And so 2 out of 3 in the Deep South don't own slaves, and 3 out of 4 in the Upper South don't own slaves. And without getting into how the numbers work, obviously, and you should know this already, the big plantations with, many, many slaves, those are not common. Those are the elites. Those are the 1%. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of all slaves lived on what we would call a plantation, and 50% lived in smaller family units with yeoman farmers. But of course, because plantations had such large numbers of slaves, they were still a big minority within Southern society. Now, this is important to understand. The federal government does not determine if you are a citizen or not. It is up to the states to determine whether or not you are a citizen. And I don't need to tell you that blacks are not citizens in most U.S. states, and in no states where slavery is legal. Either free or slave, if you are a child of Africa, you are not a citizen. Slaves do not have many legal rights. They cannot own property. Their marriages are not legally recognized under law. There are laws in place against abuse. Obviously, there's laws in place against murder. You can't kill a slave. That's still considered murder. The problem is it's very difficult to enforce these laws because slaves cannot, for example, testify against whites in court. Blacks can't testify against whites in court. Juries tend to be made up of slave owners, that sort of thing. And so, in a functional way, slaves have no legal rights. Even those that exist on the book to look after them are not particularly enforced. Your status as a slave is determined by your mother. If your mother is a slave, then you are a slave. And that is relevant because it's certainly possible that your father could be white. There's enormous debates over the extent to which white men had sexual relations with black women, the slave owner visiting the cabins, as we would say. But nonetheless, it certainly did happen to some extent. Sally Hemings is the best example of that with Jefferson. But it would not matter if your mother is a slave, you are a slave, regardless of any white ancestry you may have. The overwhelming majority of slaves were what we call field hands. I'll put that one on the board. A field hand is exactly what you would know, somebody who is expected to do agricultural labor. And the overwhelming majority of slaves fell into that category. And of course, when it comes to cash crop agriculture, they could be used to cultivate tobacco, they could be used to cultivate rice. We saw that in the movie. Indigo, hemp. During the antebellum era, increasingly, as we know, it was cotton. And that's because south of the Ohio River, cotton grows in abundance. We've already gone there. And so that link between slavery and cotton cultivation emerges during that era. But before then, it was tobacco and rice and other things. Owners of slaves were expected to provide them with basic necessities. If you are the owner of a slave, you have to feed them, you have to clothe them, you have to give them shelter. You have to hire, bring in a doctor if they get sick, et cetera, et cetera. Generally speaking, their material lifestyle was the equivalent of what we would see a poor farmer have. They would generally be provided with a small slave cabin, with a little fireplace and basic furniture. They would be given clothing that fit the idea of doing field work all day. Slaves were generally adequately fed. There's no real evidence that they were denied food, although their diets would be very basic. Everybody's diet back then is very basic. They pretty much lived on corn and pork. That was it. And garden vegetables would be grown on farms and plantations, and they would do that as well. Life in the slave-holding states was not necessarily segregated. Blacks and whites lived among each other. You can't have slavery without it. Slaves live on the very same farm as their masters. Slaves would live on the very same plantation as their masters, unless that master was an absentee owner, and many plantation owners were, but you get the idea. They would frequently attend church with their masters. And surprisingly, the sermons were always about obedience, right? They were always about how, God expects you to follow orders and your reward waits later on. Not a whole lot of discussion of the book of Exodus in the antebellum South. That book of the Bible doesn't really exist if you go to a church where the whites and the blacks are attending together. They would sit in different sections of the church. Oftentimes in churches, there would be a place for the slaves and then a place for the whites. We've gone through this before already. That's not everything about it, though. A plantation itself has to be discussed. Now, again, this is not the common part of the South. Okay, there's a lot of different types of farms, but the plantations are what most people identify with the slavery era. So we have to talk about how a plantation works. First of all, it's important to understand that a plantation is a business. It is a for-profit agricultural operation. And for the most part, it focuses on producing one crop. Cotton, hemp, rice, tobacco, you get the idea. This is about making money. This is capitalism. And as I just mentioned, frequently, the plantation owners don't actually live on the plantations. They could be absentee owners. This is an investment for them. You can live in one place and invest in a plantation somewhere else and profit. And so we will assume, since we're talking about the plantation era, that we're talking about a cotton plantation. So what does it take to make it a plantation? Well, definitions vary, but generally speaking, it becomes a plantation when there are at least 200 acres dedicated to the commercial crop. There are at least 200 acres where the money crop is grown, and at least 20 active field hands. At least 20 active field hands. Now keep in mind, that doesn't mean 20 slaves, because there's going to be elderly slaves that don't work anymore. There's going to be young children that aren't put in the fields yet. So there could be 30, 40, 50 slaves, but 20 of which are field hands. On a plantation, there is a clear delineation between the management and the labor. The owner of the plantation is not in the fields working with the slaves. Small slave owners, small yeoman farmers that might own slaves, they're out in the fields working with them. They all work together in the field. But on a plantation, boss man, the master, the owner, he doesn't work in the fields. He's the manager. In addition to maintaining the operation of the plantation, the owner, the man of the house, if you will, is in charge of the economics. He's got to balance the books. If I'm going to make money, I got to do the accounting. And oftentimes these guys may appear to be very wealthy, but frequently they are deeply in debt. Because they would borrow money to buy slaves. They would borrow money to buy more land. They would borrow money to buy seed or equipment. Lots of money is borrowed by these plantation owners. And the idea is I pay it off over time, or I pay it off when the crop comes in, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of debt going on. They would frequently pay for insurance on their slaves, life insurance. Because, of course, your slave is an investment. And so if he dies, well, I want to get my money back. They would owe a lot of money to banks. Money would be borrowed to buy slaves. And a lot of these banks were northern banks. And I bring this up because we have to understand that the slave system is part of America's DNA. It wasn't just the direct slave owner that was profiting from this. The banks that are loaning money are obviously profiting too. The insurance companies are making money from this. The slave traders are making money from this. Absentee slave owners, plantation investors that could have been, living in the North would also have a role to play in this. There's a lot of people that are, profiting off of this human labor. Also on a plantation was the plantation wife, the mistress, the wife of the owner. Her job is to maintain the social fabric of the plantation. Hold parties, entertain. She will educate her children when they are little. She is their primary school teacher. And the real wealthy planters would bring in tutors for that sort of thing too. And the idea is that the sons get sent off to school later on when they become older. Her job is also to find suitable husbands for her daughters, preferably from the planter families. And so that's why the socialization is so important. Have events where the different planter families get together and meet and spend time together, and we're arranging our children so they will become the next generation. And this is why these social rules and customs become so critically important. Exactly how you're supposed to behave and carry yourself. You're presenting your daughter as a suitable plantation wife, so she has to have all the right mannerisms and wear all the right clothing, and you have to show that your family has plenty of wealth. So the shows of that are critical. And when we were talking about Fluoride Calhoun and how she was so rude to Peggy Eaton, all of that came from that tradition that she had been raised in. Women have to behave exactly a certain way if they're in the upper class in order for their families to be considered respectable. And these things can become very, very precise and defined. Things like music and dancing and how to properly conduct yourself in a social context is what plantation girls are taught. In addition to field hands, some slaves on plantation would be house servants. You know, the cooks and the maids and the butlers. Sort of a running idea there is that the field hands don't trust them. The field hands don't really like these because they're too close to the whites. They're too close to the master and his family. They weren't necessarily invited to take part in the culture. You know, when the sun went down and the music played and the fires were lit and everybody was relaxing, well, the field hand, the house servants, well, they're not invited. And besides, they're in there working anyway. And if you think that you'd rather be in the big house than out in the field, just keep in mind that plantation wife has got her eye on you all the time. And you follow her orders no matter what they are. And the only answer you give is yes, ma'am. And you can imagine how trying that would be over time. Some slaves are also going to be skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths and carpenters, people like that. These were very valuable. They tended to live much better than the others on a plantation, and they often passed these skills on to their sons. They would often be deeply respected among the plantation slaves because they play a leadership role. Now, how do you get them to go out in the field and work all day? Because I can assure you they don't want to. Well, that's where the overseer comes in. A plantation was expected to have someone who was in charge of managing the slave labor. And the overseer was typically a white male who came from the lower classes or the working classes. You know, he did not come from the plantation elite. He came from the rabble, if you will. And he has one job, and that is to make sure that they get the job done. He is not friendly. He is tough. He is the guy that administers punishments if they don't work. He is the guy that they, quote unquote, answer to. And he answers to the owner of the plantation. And a good overseer was a tough guy who had a reputation for respect. I don't need to tell you what the slaves thought of him. There were always discussions, they always talk about how the overseers are alcoholics, how the overseers were abusive, how the overseers were just a bunch of jerks, and frequently all of that was true. You get the idea. On a plantation, the slave population would be divided into groups of about 10. And they would be given a task to do every day. You know, you 10 groups, well, y'all go and work on that 20 acres, and you go work on that 20 acres. Divide it up. Again, it's a business. And among these groups would be an older male black slave known as a driver. And he is a slave, and he is doing the work, and it is his job to keep all of the rest of them working as well. And he is always treated a little bit better and with a little bit more respect because he is a driver. Again, you can see the hierarchy working out here. Now, the workday for slaves was sun up to sundown, 6 days a week. There is a lot of debate over how much whipping actually took place. That is, of course, the most notorious, cruel and abusive action that was taken. It did happen. Generally speaking, historians consider it rather rare. Every slave is going to see it at least once in their life, but when it did take place, it was horribly brutal. The reality is you only need to see it once to know I do not want to end up like that guy. And other forms of abuse, again, it's debated, but it happened. I mean, slaves were branded whenever they mistreated. They might have a finger cut off if they were mistreated, if they were uncooperative. And we don't have time to go into revolts and things like that, so we'll have to do that next time. Older slaves, once they got to the point where they couldn't really work anymore, once they got to the point where it was just not feasible to put them in the fields, they would still live on the plantations and, tell the stories and all of that. They would often be called uncle or auntie. When the whites and the blacks would call them, Uncle Joe or Uncle Ben or Uncle Tom or Aunt whatever. And just in case you're wondering, if you eat Uncle Ben's rice, guess what you're eating? If you buy Aunt Jemima pancakes, well, Aunt Jemima's a slave. And of course, that's a touchy point. I think the company that makes the Aunt Jemima pancake mix has finally decided they're going to retire old Aunt Jemima because it's a reference to a female slave, and that's pretty offensive. Now, there's other aspects of it, but we are out of time. So I'll remind everybody, Module 4, remember, Quiz 4 is open today. Just once again, you need to take that by Sunday. You need to participate in discussion 7 or 8 by tomorrow night. We are going to kind of go over this a little bit more once we start Module 5, because I'm not entirely done with it, and I do want to discuss it a little bit more. But you'll get enough out of the notes in the modules, so look for your test grade to be put up, and if anybody has any questions, if anybody has any other issues, by all means, get in touch with me, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Take care.